It was 4 years ago when I last shared my research on positive philosophy with a room full of people. It was here at CSU on campus. In the fall of 2013, I was a freshly minted doctor, unemployed, and people wondered, oh, positive philosophy. I've never heard of it. What's that? So now, in the fall of 2017, people's reactions are pretty much still the same. And that's okay, because positive philosophy is my own concept, and I developed it, but aside from my dissertation research, I haven't published anything else on it. So my research, it seems, gets primarily shared with others through talks like this, at least in theory. In practice, if you look closely and pay careful attention, you can see that positive philosophy also permeates most of what I do as a person and a professional nearly every day. But I'll get to that in a bit. For now, my primary aim is to introduce you to what I call positive philosophy and share my understanding of how it has shifted over the past year and a half in particular. And more specifically, I want to share how I've seen the significance of positive philosophy develop since the last presidential campaign and election of 2016. So, first, some background. Okay, I'm a philosopher by training, which means I work with and through theory. I value ideas, concepts, theoretical frameworks, and then understanding the relationships among them. As a philosopher, I've been most fascinated with epistemology. That is what we know or don't know, and how and why we know or don't know it. Whereas scientists find thrill in discovery, or artists put passion into expression, the epistemologist in me finds excitement in learning and developing thinking and understanding. So I center my work on the importance of what is called knowledge, precisely because what we claim to know is directly associated with what we value as true and real and good and right. Inextricably embedded within what we claim to know, you can find ethics, politics, and quite literally the foundations for the world we erase, destroy, or create, and then the means through which we go about doing those things. As a feminist philosopher, my passion stems from doing theory in ways that challenge and change the status quo, that disrupt dominant narratives, which perpetuate and maintain systems of oppression. My feminist commitments mean that doing philosophy is an explicitly political project, and my questions center on issues of power, privilege, and liberation from oppression. For me, good theory is intimately connected to, informed by, and geared towards practice. It seeks to name, articulate, and understand our concrete, lived experiences in liberatory ways. In fact, like bell hooks and so many others, I believe that doing theory can itself be an important and meaningful practice for liberation. As far as I can tell, doing good theory involves the head. It requires a lot of critical thinking. But good theory is connected to the heart, too. I believe that it can provide resources for the strength to persist, to live, to grow, to thrive, and to fight for change. Sometimes that means directing our theories at changing the world, but oftentimes that means developing theories that have the capacity to change us and how we are in it. One reason why I'm so passionate about this is because engaging with good theories changed me and my life. I would consider myself a thoughtful and curious person. As a child, I loved learning, and I still like the creativity involved with making connections and expanding my own understanding. I loved exploring questions and then that sense of awe that one feels upon realizing the vast amounts of things that you know you don't know or understand, from the cosmos to, for me, how refrigerators work. I still revel in the excitement of having my mind blown from finally seeing something that's been right in front of me all along. Even with this disposition, I remember a critical time when my excitement for learning was stifled. For the first 2 years of college, I was clear on my interests and what mattered to me. So I took classes on gender, race, class inequality, human rights, social movements. But class after class, I felt frustrated I didn't feel challenged. And worse, I felt like my education centered on learning the descriptions of these realities without gaining a practical sense for how to change them. So disappointed and on the verge of dropping out, I took a class with a professor that changed everything. He introduced me to aspects of feminist theory and queer theory, and then related those theories to questions that have since become some of my questions. Who is the philosopher? What is philosophy? And importantly, what can philosophy do? So with this renewed excitement, I took a couple independent studies on feminist and queer theory, and then that sparked my own appreciation for the power of theory, and this was my personal experiential seed to what I would continue to explore and eventually develop into a practice of positive philosophy. Okay, so thus far I've emphasized theory in the context of doing philosophy. But it's important to know that the heart of what I call positive philosophy is not necessarily philosophy per se. There are historical and political reasons for why I situate this as a means or a mode of engaging in philosophy. But technically, my own moment of renewed excitement was created in a religious studies course on Christianity with a professor who was hired as a theologian in residence. So regardless of what I've been calling theory, it can be generally understood to include a range of practices like critical thinking, maybe philosophizing, or reflection as part of what Paulo Freire referred to as praxis, that is action and reflection on the world as a means for changing it. Now, I could give countless concrete examples of how engaging in theory changed me in my life regarding specific experiences related to race, gender, sexuality, and more. But the point is, thanks to learning from the insights of other theorists, I've developed my own capacity to critically think about my life, my experiences, my body, and my identities, and how all of this fits into larger systems that oppress me and others in various ways. In turn, my capacity for critical thinking and considering alternative narratives has translated into a kind of strength, courage, confidence, and commitment to confront and challenge those systems when and where they seek to limit me, my freedom, and the freedom of others. Locating myself in the world through theory and articulating my own experiences has been affirming and empowering, particularly around identities and specific everyday things that are typically regarded as sources of shame, confusion, or worthlessness. In addition to feeling empowering, another appropriate way to describe my relationship with theory is that of healing. Even if I were to detail specific instances when theory helped me navigate those difficult realities and everyday experiences, that still wouldn't quite fully illustrate what it can feel like to get there. So, oppression is a hideous and painful reality. Feminist work is geared towards ending oppression, which means that feminist theory interrogates and focuses on oppression in all forms in order to challenge it. Like most anti-oppression work, feminist theory does not look away from the ugliness of oppression, but rather looks it in the face and memorizes its pores. Most of the time, the sort of theory I engage with explicitly centers on some of the most violent, harmful, hurtful, and painful parts of our human existence. And it forces us to look at those realities as they show up in ourselves and in our lives. But we who engage in this type of work are not simply masochists. Something else can happen when we confront the social, political, and personal realities of oppression in ways that don't just seek to merely describe them, but rather change them. Developing new ways to understand and make sense of even the most painful parts of ourselves and our world can be exciting. It can be exhilarating and affirming to have our experiences named and reframed. It can feel good to undermine existing systems of power that undermine the lives of the oppressed. And challenging dominant and oppressive knowledge claims and then creating new ones, even in theory, are acts of resistance. And doing so can heal us. This is the purpose of practicing positive philosophy. So as I worked through my dissertation, I reflected on my own experiences of oppression and marginalization and how specific theories animated, revitalized, motivated, inspired, encouraged, affirmed, and empowered me to think and feel differently about myself and my place in the world. This struck me as significant because oppression, by its very nature, is a force that denigrates and works to keep people down. Of course, oppression operates through violence, intimidation, discrimination, colonization, harassment, brutality, deprivation, and other overt and institutionalized ways. So for the oppressed, the negative effects of oppression are very real and come in many forms: physical, financial, social, political. But as if the experience of one's oppression isn't difficult enough, by reflecting on my own experiences and the accounts of others, I started paying attention to the negative physiological, psychological, and emotional effects of oppression. We know that stress is a killer, but stress is like the amicable cousin of oppression. The violence of oppression compounds through producing negative affective burdens that we carry within ourselves and our bodies. I'm talking about fear, anger, shame, alienation, dehumanization, isolation, self-loathing, hopelessness, helplessness, depression, anxiety, exhaustion, addiction, and despair. When you've been repeatedly kicked down, these negative affective burdens further deplete you and keep you feeling down, maybe even to the point where you feel like you don't want to get up again, maybe even to the point where you don't want to fight the good fight any longer. So as far as I could tell, it is politically and philosophically significant that oppression makes us feel so bad, so heavy and so exhausted that part of the struggle is simply having the energy to carry on, let alone fight. So in this way, oppression does not only produce, but actually works through the negative affective burdens of the oppressed. More than just unhappy byproducts of oppression, the production of negative affects and emotions is an integral part of how oppression is perpetuated and maintained. This is why self-care is a necessary act of resistance. This is also why resistance includes celebrating and taking pride in the aspects of ourselves that have been marginalized. This is why affirmations of excellence, power, resilience, beauty, joy, and strength have been crucial aspects of reclaiming histories, traditions, cultures, and bodies of the historically oppressed. We seek to create, hold on to, and heal from cultivating positive feelings because oppression strives to give us only the bad ones. So thus, to thrive in a world that seeks your demise is undeniably an act of resistance. With this in mind, I wondered about the significance of all those good feelings I had that resulted from me thinking more philosophically. As far as the connections between positivity, thinking, and healing goes, psychologists had already been looking into that. The relatively newish field of positive psychology champions the notion of positive thinking. They claim it's not enough to simply rid oneself of negative emotions like anxiety or depression, for that will eventually just leave one with nothing. Instead, one must cultivate positive emotions like gratitude. By studying people's hearts, brains, blood pressure, and other empirical things that philosophers tend to steer clear of, positive psychologists found that increasing positive emotions had impressive effects on improving overall health, happiness, longevity, and well-being. So that's positive psychology, and it's a pretty cool story. I appreciated the empirical evidence that positive emotions are good for us, but I was skeptical of the politics of who gets to practice gratitude and how that could maintain oppressive status quo. I wasn't about to run around telling the oppressed to practice more gratitude and then call that a day. So I took the liberty to extrapolate those findings and assume, could it be possible to produce similar healthful and healing cultivating positive affective experiences from critical thinking, like engaging in theory? For one, I think this is true because of how theory excites me and helps me navigate very difficult and stressful situations with less shame and anxiety and much more pride and self-love. I also think this is true because I know how good it can feel to make knowledge claims that establish you as right, good, and true, especially when the world has been constructed to tell you that you and your existence are wrong. Morally, politically, psychologically, and emotionally, it feels good to be right. That's one reason why it's so tempting to make what I call righteous knowledge claims. However, the epistemologist in me became very skeptical of righteous knowledge claims. So remember, I center my work on the importance of what is called knowledge. Inextricably embedded within what we claim to know, you can find ethics, politics, and quite literally, the foundations for the world we erase, destroy, or create, and the means through which we go about doing those things. So if our only goal was to produce positive affects to overshadow the negative ones we get from being oppressed, we would already have it made. We could look right in the face of oppression and scream, "No, you are wrong, I am right." And all the good and positive feelings that stem from knowing we are right would embolden, inspire, energize, and excite us to fight for change. But beneath righteous knowledge claims, even those that I tend to and want to believe, I see potential for them to be motivated out of desperation, a fear of being wrong, a deep longing to cling to something that recognizes our position and establishes our place as right in the world. This, it seemed to me, was eerily similar to what oppressors do and say. Cut from the same cloth, maybe righteous knowledge claims are part of the same system of oppression, just another distant cousin of dominant narratives that righteously assert knowledge claims like, "I'm right, you're wrong," and holding tightly to that helps me feel better about myself. See, even in saying that now, it's hard to discern if I'm speaking as the oppressor or the oppressed. And that is the danger of righteous knowledge claims. In other words, theory is powerful because it can reframe, reconstruct, and rearticulate our experiences of oppression in order to challenge it. But if we are not careful, we may seek out theories that make us feel better by merely assuring us that we are right and can lay claim to truth. So I needed to go further. I wondered if there were more powerful resources for resistance and healing when we focus on how we think and our habituated ways of knowing. Positive philosophy is not about theorizing in ways that make us feel better by simply giving us counter-narratives to yell in the face of dominant ones. It's not about collecting good feelings from when we can claim to know what's right. Instead, it's about renouncing the common fear of the unknown and even a fear of being wrong. It's about rejecting the will and the desire for certainty. Positive philosophy is about developing the capacity for positive affective experiences while exploring and creating new ways of understanding from a place of not knowing. It's about generating pleasure, excitement, and energy from engaging in an open-ended process of critical thinking in ways that counter the negative affective burdens of oppression. So positive philosophy is not about seeking good feelings by simply thinking we are right and others are wrong. The capacity for positive affective experiences is rooted in how we interact and engage with what we claim to know. The capacity for positive affective experiences is developed in us, not through developing definitive theories. Positive philosophy, then, is about thinking better and feeling better. That is part of its mode of resistance. And thus, I titled my dissertation, Positive Philosophy, a Feminist Practice of Affective Therapy and Political Resistance. Okay, so now fast forward to 2016, when the presidential campaign pulled my attention to the AltRight, to the increased visibility and outspokenness of white supremacists, men's rights activists, and others who, despite largely coming from historically dominant groups like those of straight, cisgender white men, now fervently claimed that they are being marginalized, threatened, discriminated against, and even oppressed. So this is more than just a whiny group of white dudes who can be ignored and dismissed, since the explicit opponents of social justice and civil rights movements are holding it down in mainstream media and the White House. Out of curiosity, I began exposing myself to their thought processes by checking out their websites, watching their documentaries for as much as I could muster, and listening more carefully to what they say about their causes. Not only were they co-opting language that describes experiences of oppression, but they were also echoing the language of the negative affects that burden the oppressed. So whether I wanted to validate their feelings or not, this is what I heard. A felt loss of sense of self, a loss of community, a loss of culture, a felt loss of power, fear or threat of isolation, alienation, marginalization, discrimination. Even men's rights activists cite high rates of suicide, heart disease, and addiction, which could be the physiological correlates to those negative affects. So for better or worse, I'm not often engaging with folks who explicitly align themselves with alt-right or white supremacy movements. However, I am constantly in spaces with good-intentioned, well-meaning white people, and I hear them express similar feelings. They are my family members who voted for Trump. They are women who get defensive if you call them white feminists. They are my colleagues who fear that they will be viewed as racist. And they are my white students who want to critically reflect and understand their privilege, even if it is difficult at times to do so. So with all of these bad feelings floating around in predominantly white spaces through people with multiple dominant and privileged identities, I had a very uncomfortable epiphany last spring. I developed the notion of positive philosophy as a practice of resistance for the oppressed. But is it possible that positive philosophy could be equally appropriate for oppressors? And if so, what does that say about my theory? Does this mean that my next project should be positive philosophy, a feminist practice of affective exorcism and political transformation? Maybe so. Okay, so now we can go in a lot of different directions to explore why that might be a possibly important venture, but instead I want to share a scenario of something that happened in my class several weeks ago. 4 of my students were giving their group presentation. This assignment is for students to meet outside of class, dig deeper into the materials that we discussed during the lecture earlier in the week, and they are to have a rich conversation on their own, then bring back ideas and questions and insights to the rest of class to help further our collective conversation. On this particular week, we were reading Peggy McIntosh's essay on white and male privilege, and coupled that with an essay by Allison Bailey on how to develop the character of a white race trader. The students started by acknowledging that they were approaching the text as 4 white women, or, as we have started saying this semester in my classes, as 4 women of whiteness. This signals that it's not just the fact that they have pale, light skin that is the most significant to note, but rather that they have been socialized and conditioned to not see their own whiteness as part and parcel to a culture of domination in the service of white supremacy. So these 4 women of whiteness summarized their conversation, and I will say they seemed very eager to share this week, more so than is often the case sometimes. We sketched out the main points that they touched on from the text, and that started a pretty engaging conversation with the rest of the class. About midway through our time together as a class, I asked the room if they felt that they now had a good handle on white privilege. As most students raised their hand, I noted, but many of you said that this is the first time you've heard of or really thought about white privilege. So to say that you get it now with so much confidence is potentially one of the whiteliest things you could do. See, I kept challenging them to see that whiteness is everywhere, and almost everything they did, if they paid close attention and looked carefully enough, would still demonstrate some or a lot of whiteness. In fact, even when we discussed one of the main points of the text, which is to become privilege cognizant rather than privilege evasive when it comes to recognizing the things that white people do that manifest whiteness, we ultimately landed on a critical insight. There are many ways in which being privilege cognizant could actually just be more sneaky forms of whiteness. Like thinking that once you read an essay on privilege that you are sufficiently now privilege cognizant. So together as a class, we came up with this important insight to build upon what we had learned from the theories in the text. And something else was happening. So I shifted the conversation again, and I asked my students if they could imagine what it would feel like to actually be so privilege cognizant that one could then live as a race trader, to be a white person who embodied the commitment for racial justice rather than being a person of whiteness who just really didn't want to be racist. They said they could not yet imagine what it would feel like to have such a paradigm shift. So then I asked, well, what does it feel like to be where you are right now? How does it feel to learn about whiteness and be told that even when you think you've got it, you are probably still manifesting whiteness? Most of us can probably relate to what they said because it's difficult to want to do good, think you're doing the right things, and then realize you're still stepping in it. So they said a lot of things. They felt guilt and shame. They named a kind of loss, a lack, or a longing for something. They felt disappointment, a sense of failure, and even some fear around what to do. They said this process was overwhelming, like they didn't know how to take a step in any direction, which made them feel insecure and very frustrated. So recognizing that there are very important differences between the causes of these negative feelings and then the sort of negative affective burdens that are felt by those who are oppressed, these are still negative affects. And they are commonly felt by a lot of people of whiteness, especially among those who say they desire to act and change in ways that support social justice and healing. But furthermore, these negative affects often hinder the very people who have so much room to grow and change from doing just that. So I shifted again. And I remind you that even though this may feel overwhelming, we were still able to come up with a pretty powerful new understanding. We named potential risks of being privileged cognizant that could actually help people of whiteness, namely many of them, to understand how they really could do better. They got that, and we did that together. So I asked, what did that process feel like? How does that make you feel? And like music to my ears, I kid you not, 3 students of whiteness, one after the other, said, it's kind of exciting. It's sort of empowering, to see how we could do things differently. And then from the back, it's humbling. Exciting, empowering, and humbling. Even with the students of whiteness in my class, we practiced positive philosophy to unpack privilege and challenge the ubiquity of whiteness while resisting the temptation to make righteous knowledge claims that would leave them feeling good in all the wrong ways. I hope that no student of mine walks out of class thinking that they have definitive answers, but I really hope they leave feeling that something positive happened during our time together. Something that encourages them to keep challenging their own thinking rather than getting stuck on the hard and heavy feelings that could make them become complacent with it. And finally, I also hope they have a positive affective experience that I hope for all people with privilege and dominant identities so that they can use this to frame such moments when they have them. And that is gratitude. I hope my students and people with dominating identities are grateful for the opportunities they have all around them to learn how to do and be better. I hope they are grateful for the insights and resources that support their process of coming to consciousness. And in particular, I hope they are grateful to those who have persistently fought and struggled against their own oppression, because that struggle enables oppressors to more fully realize their own humanity. So maybe there is a place, after all, for positive psychology's call for gratitude, if we use a critical lens to explore the politics of who should practice gratitude and how that then could destabilize the oppressive status quo. If those with privilege started running around expressing their genuine gratitude to those who have afforded them opportunities to get more in touch with their own humanity, I may even call it a small win for the day. So now, I'll conclude with 3 thoughts. Number 1, I do think that positive philosophy can be useful for both sides of the political divide. We help heal ourselves and participate in practices of resistance when we cultivate our capacity to take pleasure in critically thinking about ourselves and our place in the world, especially when it comes to understanding how oppression works on and through us in order to undermine it. Second point, some of the positive affective experiences I recommend we cultivate our excitement and empowerment from engaging in practices of critical reflection, humility rather than righteousness with our knowledge claims, and gratitude for our continued learning. And third, especially as educators, we must create conditions and environments of support that foster and nurture these practices in everyone, and then continually do this work within ourselves and with others. That means going through the process with them so they don't feel so lost that they can't take another step, even if they don't know where they're going, while still recognizing that this process is not definitive. We should not strive to arrive. Thank you.